This story too wonderful to resist of Jesus walking on the water, and it's really interesting to me anyway. Matthew, Mark, and John all have this story, but Luke doesn't have it. Normally it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke that have the same stories, and John does some other things. But here it's Matthew, Mark, and John. And I also found it interesting that Matthew is the only one who talks about Peter walking on the water, which suggests to me that as important and wonderful a detail as that is, it is not absolutely essential to the story. If it were, they would all have it, right? So I want to look at the story. I want to take my cue from that observation and look at the story as a whole. Most of the time you hear about Peter walking in the water, but I want to think about the disciples out there struggling with the boat and the wind and the waves, and Jesus up there praying and all that. So I just want to notice the obvious at the outset, and this is the omnipotence and sovereignty of Jesus. Back in Matthew 8, we have the disciples in the boat in the storm, and Jesus, remember, he's in the back sleeping in the stern. They're in a terrible storm. They're about to lose the boat, and they're afraid they'll drown. And they're not just like tourists. These guys some of these are experienced fishermen. They know the sea, and they're afraid they'll drown. And they're not just freaking out for nothing. Their Jesus is sleeping in the stern, right? And of course, they wake him up, and he rebukes the wind and the waves, and there's suddenly a great calm. And it seems the disciples are still getting to know him because they marvel and they ask, "What sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey?" And we see a good measure of that this morning, too, don't we? And him getting in the boat and walking in the water and instantly a calm. Well, what sort of man is this that even winds and sea obey him? And well, the answer is, he's the Almighty. That's who this is. Right? And my mind always goes to the Lord's response to Job when I think about this. This is the same one who, when Job questioned God about the state of his life and all of his suffering, why did you make me, God? Why am I here? This sort of thing. The Lord turns the tables on Job and essentially says, "Be still, O man, and I have some questions with you." And this is what I just want to remind you of what's in there. When God talks to Job, he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth?" This is God telling Job something, telling us something about himself, with the things that he has done, the things that he has cared for and power over. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? And who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? And when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus you shall come and no farther. Here shall your proud waves be stayed. And if you commanded the morning, since your days began, you caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it. And he continues on, have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Where is the place of darkness? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which are reserved for time of trouble, the day of battle and war? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? On and on he goes, just chapter after chapter, just unveiling all the wonderful works of creation that God has mastery and control over. So, what sort of man is this? He says, have you done all these things, O man? And then he's implying, well, I have. God said, I have done all these things. I'm the one who's done them all. I'm the only one who has or ever will be able to do these things. All of creation, all of it, it is mine. I have made it, and it exists to serve me and to delight me. And I will do with them all as I wish. This is the sentiment of God towards all of creation. And so, what sort of man is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? I mean, it all obeys him. Right? The smallest little quantum particle, right? The inner workings of an atom, the complexity of an ant colony, the course of human events, the revolution of the earth and the planets, the inner workings of the sun, the gravity and rotation of our galaxy, the movement and organization of millions and billions of galaxies across the cosmos. Right? And then you have countless legions of angels swarming around the throne of God. Right? They glory in and they celebrate His presence from all eternity. And they all hang on His every word, and their sole delight is to jump at His every command. What sort of man? That's the sort of man this is. And of course, the winds and the sea obey Him. The Son of God made them all. They were made by Him, and He made them for Himself. There is nothing He doesn't rule over. And so that's why He can command the wind and the waves and all this. And this is why when a murderous crowd wanted to throw Him off a cliff in Luke 4, when it came down to it, they found they couldn't touch Him. They wanted to murder Him, and they were getting ready to. They'd murdered people before. They're getting ready to do it again, but they couldn't lay a hand on Him. It just says, passing through their midst, He went away. He just walked right through the middle of the murderous crowd. And nobody ever just had to let Him go. You know, other times the Pharisees would try to arrest Him, but suddenly they wouldn't be able to see Him. They lost Him in the crowd. Right? Or He would simply escape without effort. Or the crowd would try to grab Him. But again, nobody was actually able to lay hands on Him. We hear why in John 7, verse 30, because His hour had not yet come. So essentially, when they go to seize Him before His hour had come, before the time He had appointed, He's essentially saying, it's not time yet, boys. You're not taking me in today. Like some kind of outlaw, right? You're not taking me in today. Not just yet. You'll give me the time I've determined. John 10:18. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. Matthew 28:18. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now, thinking about the scope of this helps us to understand what's going on when Matthew and Mark in this story tell us that after the feeding of the 5,000, this is the context of the story, He's just fed the 5,000. And He's surrounded by at least 10,000 people that evening. And what does Jesus do? You know, a crowd of 10,000, who can manage that, right? What human being who could control what they're going to do? No, but it says Jesus, well, I just read this in the gospel. Jesus made His disciples get into the boat. He said, boys, get in the boat. What did they do? They get in the boat. And then He dismissed the multitudes. He says, you all need to leave now. And they leave. Just like that. Yes, sir. You can command a mob, right? But there He is, the Almighty, sending His guys off the boat, telling the crowd to leave. There are no ifs, ands, and buts about it. They just do it. They just do what He says at the word of His command. He was determined to be alone in prayer. And He had willed that things would go a certain way. And so they all did what He commanded. The disciples got into the boat. People went off and settled in for the evening wherever they could find a place to camp out and spend the night. They're going to wait to see Jesus again in the morning. Those are just little hints of His power before He even walks on the water. Yeah? His authority. Now, well, the real question for us this morning is, what does He do with all this power and authority? What does He do with it? Well, what's it like? What's His heart, His intentions towards I found this wonderful passage in Psalm 147. He determines the number of the stars. He gives to all of them their names. Great is our Lord and abundantly power. His understanding is beyond measure. And the psalmist tells us this so that he can put that as the backdrop and give credibility and confidence to us in what he said in verse 3 immediately before. What does he say? He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. That's what he does with all the power. He gives the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. This is his desire, no one can question his ability to do it. And so this, I think, really helps us to understand what happens next in the story of the disciples in the boat and all that, right? So I just want to pull some application out of the story, thinking about what Jesus does in his power. I want to think it through together. If you've got your Bibles this morning, hopefully you do most Sunday morning, you might put a finger here in Matthew 14 and also in Mark 6. It's helpful to flip back and forth so you can see a fuller account of the story. And so Jesus sends them all away. And what happens next? Matthew simply says, after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. It's very characteristic, yeah? And there he is, communing alone with his Heavenly Father. It was his favorite thing to do. And this is how he chose to fill his spare hours. It was in prayer. It wasn't really his spare hours, though, were they? Those were his primary hours. And I think his spare hours were spent ministering to people. Maybe I got that backward. But he spent many sleepless nights sort of peacefully and energizingly in prayer. I bet he came out of those prayer sessions ready to go.
Thank you.
Right? He didn't miss the sleep from what he gained. And then Matthew tells us when evening came,
You had to go to the bathroom.
he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against him. That's an interesting portrait, isn't it? Jesus up there praying, meeting with the Father, and the disciples are out in the water, beaten by the waves, really struggling with the weather on the boat. Mark paints a wonderfully simple portrait of verse 47 in chapter 6. When evening came, the boat was out in the sea, and he was alone on the land. So you get Jesus on the mountain, them out there struggling. I think it's a glorious image. They're out there working hard and alone and struggling, and Jesus is alone way up in that mountain praying, communing with the Father, and no doubt praying for them, praying for those disciples as they're out on the water struggling. And John tells us that the guys were 25 to 30 stadia away in the water. That's about 3 to 4 miles out struggling. So they're far from Christ at this time. And they're struggling hard. They're rowing against the wind in the rough waters, presumably making slow headway if they're getting anywhere at all. They're exhausted. They hadn't done anything wrong, and they're struggling. And they're being obedient, weren't they? He said, go out. So they went out and did exactly what he said, and then the weather comes. I want this to remind us that obedience to God doesn't mean you won't struggle and have very real challenges in your life. I want you to hear this morning. Obedience to God doesn't mean life will be a cakewalk. Can you relate to what I just said? In fact, I'm going to go even farther. Sometimes those who suffer most are those who are the most obedient. And think of martyrs to Christ. Throughout the centuries. We've got many in our own century right now, in China, in Iran, and Muslim countries. And they're tortured and they're killed simply because they love Jesus. And I think of stories of missionaries like Hudson Taylor in China in the 19th century. He lost several children and his wife in the mission field. In the 20th century, Elizabeth Elliot, her husband was murdered by the very Amazonian tribes that he was trying to reach with the gospel. Right? They get off the plane and they're cut down. And hundreds of thousands of others who suffered in obedience, bringing the gospel to those in need. They're all being obedient and they all suffer greatly for the sake of Christ. Many of you have even tasted this kind of thing in when your love for Christ has cost you maybe treasured relationships, maybe financial opportunities. You've just gotten a little tiny taste of what I'm talking about. And obedience to the Almighty is the best place to be. It's the only place to be, but no doubt it's very often costly in earthly terms. So there's suffering in their obedience. And again, Jesus is up there praying. Again, Mark says the boat was out in the sea, and he was alone on the land. Now, that's a wonderful portrait of our lives in the midst of trials and difficulties. Jesus wasn't up there sleeping. He's up there in prayer. What is he doing up there while you're struggling down here? What's he doing? He's in heaven right now, praying for you to the Father. He's communing with the Father. He's mindful of you. So there he is, working for you, interceding for you, keeping his attention on you. So you are not alone. He is actively and constantly providing for you, keeping you, protecting you, sustaining you, holding you up, breathing life in you, abiding in you. He's calling you to himself. This is what he's doing while up there, while you're down here struggling. And I'm reminded about this wonderful detail Mark gives next. Okay, so the boat's out in the sea. He's alone on the land. And then Mark says this to remind us of who Jesus was then and who Jesus still is today. He says, and he saw. Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully. He saw their predicament. Now, how in the world could he see it? If you think about it, they're 3 to 4 miles out and it's dark. It's the middle of the night. How can he see them? He's God. He knows where they are. Even though he's physically not present with them, he is with them spiritually. Sometimes we forget that in our trials, don't we? We think we're alone. In your distress, he's praying for you. In your distress, he sees you. He knows. And what else? Well, what happens next in the story? Jesus knows they're out there, and then he comes to them, doesn't he? That's what Jesus does in our lives. He comes to us. He cares for you, and he'll come to you when the time is right. He's faithful. He'll show up and he'll not let you be lost. I mean, no doubt they thought he might have come a little sooner. We hear that he comes in the 4th watch of the night. It's something like 3 or 4 in the morning. And it's probably much longer than we would have liked, but then we see that, as Matthew tells us, he came to them walking on the sea. What sort of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? So there he is, walking out to them, walking on the surface of the sea, completely untroubled, I would imagine, by the wind. Do you think when he's walking on the sea, he's bobbing up and down with the waves? I don't think he was. I think it was like he was on a paved path, just smooth and still and just going forward, yeah? I'm sure he was just calm and serene and unaffected by all the chaos and the turmoil around him. There he is, just walking out. Even in the way that he comes to us, he takes away our worries and our fear. I mean, his approach brings peace to the weary. So if I'm in prayer and I'm troubled by something, and I get a sense that the grace of God is, even the thought of it coming, it brings peace to my heart. And then they see him, and they have this interesting reaction. Their blood runs cold, and they cry out in terror. Why were they scared? They were scared back in Matthew 8 about the storm, right? They're not scared of the storm. They're scared because they thought he was a ghost. There's kind of a level of power come to afflict them, right? Yeah. Why did they recognize him? I think it's a pretty simple answer to that. They weren't looking for it. So then surely this isn't Jesus coming. This has got to be something else. Right? They weren't looking for him. And it's funny because they knew by now that he was powerful enough to do something like this. So why did they recognize him? I think there are at least 2 reasons why they didn't recognize him. One is they didn't think to apply his power to their situation. I want you to think about that for a minute. When you're going through troubles, are you like them? They didn't think to apply his power to their troubled situation. You ever failed in that way as well? And I think there's another reason too. Again, I've already alluded to it. They simply didn't expect him to show up in their trouble. I mean, isn't this us so often? You know in your head that Jesus is all powerful, but we don't think to apply it to our situation, to our troubled soul and our spirit. You know, our faith is so weak, our understanding of his love and compassion is so, pathetic through our neglect of the word and of prayer that we don't expect him to want to show up in our trouble. Though we can. So we've got to apply these two attributes of his in our minds when we're struggling. We've got to remember his power. We've got to remember his love for us. We've got to remember both of those things. We've got to combine them. Make it like a medicine. I was at the pharmacist picking up something the other day with Coleman on Friday. And my pharmacist has this mortar and pestle. It's like he collects them, from making medicines and stuff. And I was thinking about grinding them up. So get your mortar and pestle on your soul. Take those two attributes of God, his omnipotence and his love for you, sort of grind them up together and make a medicine and put it on your heart. Apply that remedy to your soul. And so this is why Jesus can say, take heart, it's I. Don't be afraid. So apply these things. I'm here. Apply these things to your heart when you're troubled. And the very knowledge of his presence is meant to take away their fear and lead them to a comforting peace. And so I wonder if that actually does this for you and for me when we're in trouble. Is his presence enough for us? It's one thing to know in your head that he's everywhere. But it's completely nothing to apprehend it and rest in it with your heart. Worlds apart, those two things. Now, let's think about Peter for a minute. Matthew tells it happened, and so let's reflect on it for a minute. I don't think, some people think that Peter's maybe trying to show off. Oh yeah, I'm the most spiritual, I'm going to come out there with you, I don't think he's trying to show off. I think he just wants to be with Jesus. And I think he thinks that being with Jesus is actually way safer and better than the boat. Because they're up there rocking around and getting shoved, the wind and all that. They're just having a really hard time. And Jesus is just standing out there still. He looks more stable than the boat. He's like, how you been? Right? Isn't that a great lesson for us? And then, of course, he sings. Why does he sing? He takes his eyes off of Jesus and he looks at the waves, doesn't he? And he's looking at the waves and he's thinking about his ability, his own personal ability to manage the elements. I mean, he was just in the boat having a hard time. Now he's out there without the boat. And he's still not quite to Jesus yet. And he's thinking, I'm so stupid. Why did I come out here, right? I can't handle this. And he takes his eyes off Jesus and his power. And he puts his eyes on himself and his power. And of course he sings. What else is going to happen? Only Christ has the power to see us through. We do not. Peter needed to go up to him and just cling to him. Then he would have been fine, Just grab his arm and hold on tight, That's what he needed to do. And it's an important lesson, too, in thinking about this. Having your eyes fixed on Jesus at one point, at the beginning of your Christian journey, is not enough, is it? Peter had his eyes on Christ. He had all his confidence. He saw what he could do, saw where he was, wanted to be with him. So he gets out of the boat, which is great. He didn't keep his eyes on Jesus for the duration of the distance, and that is why he started to sink. Some of us think that we had an experience, we felt the grace of God one time at some retreat or something, and then we sort of are living off the memory of that. No, keep your eyes on him every single morning, every single minute of your day that you can have the wherewithal to think about it. Just keep your eyes on him and cling to him. This is the nature of our journey. In Christ, we're to be in faith. keep our eyes fixed on Him, just clinging to Him. And so Jesus finally gets in the boat with Peter, and two things happen. Number one, the weather instantly calms. And then what do? They worship. And then I love what they say. The last time they were on a boat and they experienced the calming of the seas, they asked a bewildered question, what sort of man is this? And now they're beginning to get the answer. They confess it, they worship Him. They don't just marvel and wonder at Him, but they worship Him. And they confess, truly, you are the Son of God. They don't fully yet know what all this means, I don't think, and what the implications of it are, but they recognize Him and they worship. This is the outcome of every trouble that we experience, as long as we're experiencing it as Christians and not like pagans. Yeah? The one who does not have faith, the one who does not have eyes on Christ, believes they are alone. Sometimes you can be a Christian and still think that, you know what I mean? You're not clinging, you're not claiming your inheritance as a Christian. You're not living into your faith, really. You think you're alone. And this is where anxiety comes from. This is where fear comes from. But the one who is living in their faith, the one who applies the power and the love of Jesus to their worry soul, to their situation, to their context, is the one who has calm and peace and joy. So I want this to be our course as individuals and as a congregation whenever trials and troubles come. I just want to sort of string some of the action points of the story together. All right? They're struggling. They struggle. Jesus prays. Jesus sees. Jesus comes. Jesus speaks. Jesus enters. And as He enters the boat, calm follows. And in response to this, they worship. This is a beautiful map for what you are to do when you are experiencing trouble. Reflect on the fact that yes, you are struggling, but yes, Jesus is praying, Jesus is seeing, Jesus is coming, Jesus is speaking, Jesus is wanting to enter in. And when He does, when I receive Him, that's when the calm comes. And that's when the heart rejoices. It all ends in worship. This is how He heals our hearts and binds up our wounds. You know? And then I love it. I like it that this little story here in our gospel, He would go on to do that physically in Gennesaret, right after this episode, right? He went and He healed the sick in their bodies, but I think His disciples were beginning to realize what he was doing to their bodies, He had already begun to do to their hearts and their souls. Healing, strengthening, restoring. You know, many of you have come in here struggling with many things. Health issues, fears about the future, fears about our political life as a nation, family issues, difficulty at work. Will you look for Him? Will you accept Him to come? Will you recognize Him when He does? Will you receive Him? Let's pray. Lord Christ, so often there are trials we don't look for. We don't think on You praying for us, being aware of us, and coming to us. Lord, help us to live into our faith, even in the trials and difficulties.